22, 16 through 18.
Okay, yep, you got it. All right, welcome to Sunday school. We're gonna get going. Welcome to First Baptist Young Professional Sunday School. Glad to have all you guys out. I'm glad to be back. We've kind of taken a little hiatus, having a baby and then doing some vacations, and came back last week. And I really appreciate the Sunday school bringing food out to our house. You guys didn't have to do that, but it's so nice to be a part of a church when you have a baby. Have people get around you, bring you food, and bless you. And thank you guys for blessing us. Couple announcements. Dress a Child is coming up. Who knows some details about Dress a Child?
I've done it.
Tell us about it.
We'll be out of town this time, but I'm telling you, it is a fun thing. And take your kids. You will get probably a family, and you just help them. Usually it's $150. You just help them pick out clothes for school, and it's a lot of fun. I hope our class will sign up and do it.
Yep, I'm going to pass this envelope around if you want to just put money in for it, and I'm sure we'll have some shoppers from the class go.
It's fun for guys, too.
Oh, yeah, they need guys, because
Okay.
you have a lot of boys, and you can
Yeah.
help them fit clothes and stuff.
Great.
Yeah, and they do need to see a lot of them.
Right.
A lot of them
Okay.
are fathers.
Okay.
You don't ask them questions, that's
Right.
one thing. You just say father.
Right.
Or
Oh, wow.
father, or mother, or both.
Okay.
Lot
That's a
of
great
our
ministry.
with kids.
Prayer request. We got to pray for Kathy Jeffcoats and her family. What a warrior for God in our church. She came out to my house when I was in the 3rd grade and made a profession of faith, and she came out to my house and talked to me about it and just explained it in a way that an elementary student can understand the gospel, and I will never forget it. And I hear she's taking a turn from the worst medically, and she's unresponsive. So let's pray for her. Let's pray for her family, her daughters, and her husband Pat, and let's lift her up. You know, I know she has crowns of glory awaiting her in heaven. She is certainly an establishment, and she has left her legacy on this church. Any other prayer requests? Owen, glad to have you. Alex, welcome back. Any other visitors? Morgan Bell. Brendan Morgan. Yes. Meredith was asking about you. So, welcome back, and I saw you join the group me as well. So good. Stay in touch. If you're not on the group me, please get on the group me. All right, so we're going to get back into Job. Actually, no, let's start off praying. Bill, you pray us, get us going.
Heavenly Father, thanks so much for this beautiful day and for the camaraderie and the love we share in this room. Thank you for the life and ministry of Kathy Jeffcoats, how much she has blessed our church and enriched our lives. It's just hard to imagine how many different individuals she has touched, and I know that the reward waiting Kathy is amazing. We pray that she'll forgive us of our sins and prepare our hearts to hear prayer this morning. Amen.
All right. So we're back on Job, okay? We've been hitting Job up all summer. Job talks a lot to us about suffering. It is one of the greatest classics in all of literature. Victor Hugo says, "Tomorrow, if all literature was to be destroyed and it was left to me to retain one work only, I should save Job." That's pretty profound. Alfred Lord Tennyson called it the greatest poem of ancient and modern times. And Daniel Webster said the book of Job, taken as a mere work of literary genius, is one of the most wonderful productions of any age, any language. Job's position in the Old Testament. So we got Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and we always kind of just generalizing here. You know, some of these books kind of teach us stuff. And in particular, we think about Job teaching us how to suffer, Psalm teaching us how to pray, Proverbs teaching us how to act. Those of us reading the Bible through with us this year, we're getting into Proverbs now, and I'm excited about that. We just finished off Psalms. We're getting into Proverbs. Keep going. We're over halfway through. Those of you who are still with us. Ecclesiastes tells us how to enjoy, and Song of Solomon tells us how to love. Job has a very specific structure. It starts off in prose, okay? And you have the prologue, 1 through 3. We talk about Job. We talk about Satan wanting to test Job, and Satan kind of challenging God that God had a hedge around him. So we kind of learn about all about Job and what a great man of stature he was. And I thought it's interesting whenever Job walked into town, all the other men stood up. That's how much just admiration they had for Job. Then we have Job's opening monologue, and then we get these 3 cycles of arguments. The first cycle with Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and Job responds to each of theirs. And then we get a second cycle, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, with Job's response to each of them. And then we get a third cycle with just Eliphaz and Bildad. And then we get into the 3 monologues, the poem of wisdom, which is chapter 28, Job's closing monologue, 29 through 31, and then we have Elihu's speeches, which is probably the longest, most boring, and least convincing argument of the friends. And Elihu wasn't one of the 3 friends. He's just kind of this guy who showed up here at the end. And then we have 2 speeches by God, the epilogue, and Job's restoration. So today we've really gotten through this first cycle here, and I'm going to get us through the 3 friends. And I'm going to get us through the 3 friends and we're going to hit a lot of chapters today. We're going to basically go from 13 all the way through 27. And so we don't really have time to sit here and just read every particular chapter. That would probably take the entire class. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just point out highlights from each chapter that I've read and I feel like are verses. And of course, this is not comprehensive. And if you notice something in a particular chapter and I didn't talk about it, please bring it up, and I'm happy for us to discuss it. So Job's friends, who are they? Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Well, they did 3 things right. So before we start burning them up, okay, let's talk about what they did right. Okay, the first thing is Job is suffering, right? And what do? They came, right? They came, Job 2:11. And the second thing they did was they empathized with them. What did they do? They sat with him. They tore their clothes. They poured dust on themselves. They wept with him. And the third thing they did right was they spent time with him. Before they even said a word, they spent 7 days just sitting with him and comforting him. And that's what friends are for, okay? If you have friends that would do this for you, you've got a good friend, okay? So these were good friends of Job's. And before we start kind of tearing into their theology, let's remember the 3 things that they did right and that we can learn from. So meet Job's friends here. We've got Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I'll admit Zophar looks like a Jedi. But I think visual learning is the best. So we're going to give these guys some faces so that we can kind of go through and talk about their arguments. And here's Job. Job 13:4, he says, this is Job speaking. This is Job's response basically to the first cycle. He says, 13:4, he says, you, however, smear me with lies. You are worthless physicians, all of you. Well, that's interesting. He calls them physicians. They came to help him, but he's like, you're a worthless physician. There's a lot of sarcasm in Job, and I really like that. Job 13:5, he says, if only you would have been altogether silent. They'd been silent for 7 days. Why didn't they just stay silent? You know, you don't have to say anything to anybody who's suffering. Your presence alone is helpful. Job 13:9, he says, can anyone bring charges against me? If so, I will be silent and die. In Job 13:23, he says, how many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offense and my sin. Job knew he was an upright man. We know he's an upright man. How do we know that? Because Satan came to God and said, hey, you know, what about your servant Job? And even God said he is one of the most perfect and pure men on the earth. So we know he's an upright guy. And so Job's sitting here, why are you guys telling me that I've been wicked when I know I've been an upright man my whole life? Not sinless, but an upright man. Job 14, the most, I think, interesting verse here is, if a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my hard service, I will wait for my renewal to come. And this is Job, and this is interesting, is that it's obvious he believes in and longs for a life after death. And we got to think about the time in which Job was written. It was written in the patriarchal age. Okay, so this is before Jesus. This is before we have a lot of the Bible which talks about life after death in the New Testament. Okay, so this is pretty profound for him to believe this. We get to Job 15. In 15:8 it says, do you listen in on God's counsel? So this is the first round. This is Eliphaz here. He says, do you listen in on God's counsel? Do you have a monopoly on wisdom? So he's kind of calling Job out. Do you know everything? You essentially put yourself up next to God? Eliphaz accused Job of self-conceit and casting off the fear of God. In Job 15:20, he says, all his days the wicked man suffers torment. The ruthless man through all the years stored up for him. Basically what Eliphaz is saying there is that the wicked are miserable, right? And if you're miserable by association or by inference, you must be what? Wicked, right? So he's really kind of using some weird inference here. It's not necessarily God's theology, but it's just his train of thought. Eliphaz basically says if Job was as good as he claimed to be, he would never have been in this kind of trouble. Then we get to Job 16. And in the first 5 verses here, basically Job rejects their comforting again. And he says, miserable comforters are you all. Worthless physicians, miserable comforters. In Job 16:3, he says, shall vain words have an end? And Job says basically says that the tables were reversed. He will be comforting his friends as opposed to tormenting them. Job 16:11, he says, he makes this comment, God has delivered me to the ungodly. And this is important, okay? This is pretty profound. He says, God has delivered me to the ungodly. Because what does that mean? That means that, first thing is, God allowed for his suffering, right? God allowed for Satan to punish him, right? And Job has an understanding of that. So he has a lot of insight that initially we don't really give him credit for, but then when he makes these kind of comments, we understand that he's got this insight. Job, the Lord allowed for him to go through this suffering. The Lord allows Satan to tempt him, right? Nothing happens outside of God's allowance on this earth. And then we get to also in this chapter, there's remarkable allusions, okay, and overtones that point to Calvary. So if you read through chapter 16, it says, his friends did shake their heads at him. They delivered him to the ungodly. They gathered themselves together against him. They have smitten my cheek reproachfully. They have laid my horn in the dust. And that reminds you of what? Jesus' torment, right? On his way to Calvary. And, if we were in honors English, we would call this foreshadowing. But there's several instances in the Bible where the Old Testament foreshadows to the New Testament. Psalms 22 is another example that parallels Job 16. There's a couple of verses. Read it, Blake. 16 through 18.
Psalm 22.
Right.
My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. Evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hand and feet. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing.
Wow, that reminds you of something, doesn't it? That's David talking there. Job 16:17, it ends with Job saying, there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. Here Job affirms his integrity, yet Satan torments him through his friends. They cannot jilt him from his fundamental understanding of God. Job 17, Job gets scattered with his thoughts at this point. So if you've ever been around a crazy person or somebody in emotional distress, and literally becoming crazy, you find that their thoughts are very scattered. They kind of go from one topic to another because they're nervous. This is very typical of somebody under duress. And in Job 17, we see that because Job's thoughts are just kind of all over the place. But he says, the grave is ready for me in 17:1. Job in this chapter basically contemplates death and almost desires death because he's in so much pain and suffering. But yet he still does not disrespect God, right? Job 18. So here we got Bildad, right? So Bildad goes into another just basically absolute diatribe on the awful fate that should befall the wicked. Okay? In 18:1 he says, yea, the light of the wicked shall be put out. 18:17 he says, the memory of him perishes from the earth. And we know, and Job knows, there's been plenty of wicked people on this earth that have prospered. Okay? They have lived star-studded lives in the lap of luxury, whatever country or kingdom that they were in. And there's been statues and there are memories of them, of the like, within their respective communities and societies. I think of Kim Jong's, okay? You think of Fidel Castro, Ivan the Terrible, Joseph Stalin. Okay, I can go on and on. And Job points to that here in a minute. Job 19. Job begins this chapter basically lamenting again, but then he appeals to his friends. In 19:21, he says, "Have pity on me, friends, have pity on me." I mean, they're running him up the flagpole, right? But he begs him, he says, have pity on me. And in 19:25, he says, "But as for me, I know my Redeemer liveth, and that at last he shall stand upon the earth." This is another just basically epic prophecy out of Job, coming from the patriarchal age, that he knows at one point his Redeemer, God, is going to come back, and he's going to stand on this earth, and he's going to stand over the evil, and he's going to conquer this evil empire, Satan. He believes in resurrection of the dead. Okay, that's obvious. And one day his Redeemer will rule this kingdom. Job 20. So here we are at Zophar, the Jedi. In 6 through 7, he says, "Though the pride of godless person reaches to the heavens and his head touches the clouds, he will perish forever like his own dung. Those who have seen him will say, 'Where is he?' The heavens will expose his suit. The earth will rise up against him. A flood will carry off his house, rushing waters on the day of God's wrath." We're back to the same argument. The wicked will perish. You are being punished because you are wicked. Okay? Cause and effect. And here we go. Job 21 finally speaks up and says, and really makes a good case here. He points out the fact that the wicked actually do prosper on this earth. Not always, but they do in occasions. In Job 21, 7 through 8, he says, "Why do the wicked live and reach to an old age and grow mighty in power? Their offspring are established in their presence, and their descendants before their eyes." Job 21, 34, he says, "How then will you come for me with empty things? There's nothing left in your answers but falsehood." He basically said, you guys are wrong. There are plenty of wicked people out there who prosper. And then here we go at Job 22, Eliphaz, he starts taking some cheap shots. And really, at this point, Eliphaz is kind of going low. 22:5, he says, Is not your evil abundant? There is no end to your iniquities. So we got the most righteous guy on the world, the face of the earth, and Eliphaz just basically said, are you not the most wicked person ever? Job 22:8, he says, "You will decide on a matter and it will be established, and a light will shine on your ways." Now, this is an interesting verse, okay, because lots of times, I want to say false theologians, Owen, you may have to help me word this, but the prosperity gospel, okay, is thrown out there. And what they do is they put these verses out there, and they're taken out of context. So if I read you this verse, "You will decide on a matter, and it will be established for you, and a light will shine on your ways." That's pretty much, you decide it, you pray for it, you're going to get it. What does that remind you of? That's the prosperity gospel, correct? Okay? And if I just told you that, and I read that verse to you, and you didn't know the background of the context of this particular verse, what would you think? You would believe that, right? But now that I've told you that, what if I told you Eliphaz said it? Well, now you know it's false, right? Because at the very end, Eliphaz probably speaks the most false of any of these guys. And at the very end, God comes in and condemns these three friends and condemns their theology. So this is a condemned theology here. This is not correct. So be careful taking words or taking a particular verse and just applying it here and there without knowing the context to which it's being represented in the text. Job 23. Job longs for opportunity for a hearing before God. He wants to make his case for righteousness. He says in Job 23:4, he said, "I will order my cause before him and fill my mouth with arguments." So now he wants to be, Cody or Sam. He wants to be an attorney. And he wants to what? He wants to represent himself because he knows he is a righteous person. And again, God referred to Job in the opening chapters as there is none like him on earth, a perfect and upright man. So in my opinion, Job had a good case to represent himself, right? Job 24, 1 through 8, basically in this chapter beginning, he describes the conduct of the wicked, which the other friends have done as well. And then 9 through 12, he talks about how the wicked oppress the weak. And then Job 24:24, he says, "They are exalted for a little while, and then they are gone, and they are brought low and gathered up like all the others. They are cut off like the heads of grain." So basically said that in this chapter, Job says, he makes a few points that I wish the wicked were punished on the earth. I wish they were brought low like you guys say they are. But it doesn't always happen like that. But at some point when they die and they reach the afterlife and they are judged by our Creator, they will be brought low at that point. And there is judgment for the wicked, but it may not be at this lifetime and it may not be on this earth. And then Job 25. So this is like one of the shortest chapters in Job, okay? And this is like the final argument. And it's like they've run out of stuff to say, right? They really keep making the same argument, and they've run out of stuff to say. In Job 25:3, Bildad says, "Is there any number to his armies?" And he's basically saying that the Lord's army is insurmountable and that Job should surrender now. Job 25:4, it says, how can he who is born of a woman be pure? And pretty much Bildad's saying, you're a sinner just like the rest of us. And that's a good point. But in this particular case, Job is suffering not because of his sins, not because he was outside of God's grace. In Bildad's mind, Job's guilt is established. And really in all three friends, Job's guilt is established amongst them. And then Job 26 and 27, here we have Job's talking again. He begins by sarcastically again telling his friends how much help they are. Job 26:2, he says, "How you have helped me who has no power." Basically saying, some friends you are. Thanks for all the help. But then he goes into describing God's majesty. In 26:12, he says, "By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he shattered Rahab." Job 27:4-5, and Job 27:4-5, he says, My lips will speak falsehood, and my tongue, or basically says, my lips, I mistyped that, will not speak falsehood. My tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it for me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put my integrity from me. So basically, he believes that it would be a sin for him to confess sins that he didn't commit, right? So he understands that he's a righteous and upright man, and that these charges of wickedness being put on him are untrue, they're unfounded, and he's not going to admit to them. And it kind of reminds me of that Netflix, like To Make a Murderer, where they get these young guys in the room with these investigators, and they start just basically good cop, bad coping them and just playing all these psychological games, and finally, just to get out of the mental torment, they admit to it, right? Well, Job's saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sacrifice my integrity for that. So what are the friends' theology? They have a very inaccurate perception of why God's people suffer, don't they? They believe that Job was suffering because he did something wrong. Therefore, they repeatedly encourage Job to admit his wrong, repent, so that God will bless him again. So that brings the question, why do people suffer? And not only that, why do good people suffer? Okay? So to understand suffering, you understand that there's three kinds of suffering. Okay? Thanks, Owen, for coming. There's three kinds of suffering, okay? And I think the Lord prepares me, or puts people in my life, or puts things before me that helps me prepare lessons. I was in Clinton this past week. Clarence Cooper came by and see me. He's the preacher at Brandon Baptist. He's got to be a good friend of mine. That's where Michael Guest goes to church, and he has introduced me to Michael Guest. We've been helping him out with his campaign. And Clarence is a great, great godly man and a great pastor. And I told him, I'm talking on Job to my Sunday school this week, and I'm talking about these friends and basically how they're just accusing me of wicked when he's not. And I'm going to talk to him about suffering, and I almost feel bad because I've never, because I've never really, I've had some suffering in my life, but I haven't had suffering like I've seen other people suffer, okay? And I don't know that I'm an expert in it. And he said, well, Graham, you just got to teach them the three kinds of suffering. There are three kinds of suffering. He kind of broke it down in the office here. He breaks it down very quickly for me. And he's, go read this, that, and the other. And so it was totally anointed that I saw him this past week because I'm bringing some of his theology here. But basically, he says there's three kinds of suffering. There's one, there's deserved suffering, right? Okay? And the friends aren't wrong in the fact that, yes, the wicked do deserve suffering. The wicked are outside of God's grace. And many times on this earth, the wicked do get punished for being outside of God's grace, correct? So, outside of God's grace, Numbers 32:23, it says, but if you will not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. And then, so you have deserved suffering for being outside of his grace. And then you have what's called innocent suffering. Okay? Innocent suffering, we think about like natural disasters, racial prejudices, abortions. Okay? Think about the innocent lives that have suffered through natural disasters. I think about the tsunami in 2004. It killed 230,000 people, many of which were probably innocent along the Indian Ocean shore. You think about how many abortions have been committed in this country, okay? That's innocent life being taken, okay? Think about the racial prejudices in the history of this country with slavery, lynchings. I'm sure there's lots of innocent people that shed innocent blood and gave their lives innocently because of racial prejudices. As Christians, we should vehemently oppose innocent suffering, and we should stand to help those who are innocently suffering. Natural disasters, we should be the first on the scene. I think about Katrina and my dad, who's a Christian, got in his car and just drove south. And he was like one of the first people to get there, you know. Then we have righteous suffering, okay? So righteous suffering is different. So we not only don't sin, but we do what is right. We stand for Jesus Christ in the gospel, and we what? We suffer for it. So we know a lot of people that this has happened to, right? Why did Cain murder Abel? Well, 1 John 3:12 says that it was because of his own deeds were evil, and his brother was righteous. Abel was a righteous man, lived a righteous life, shed innocent, righteous blood. Okay? Job points to that. Job says at one point in here, Job asked God, he said, why am I getting treated like Abel? So then we think about other people like the apostles, missionaries, the martyrs, the saints. We could say Stephen, Andrew, Simon Peter, Polycarp, Jim Elliot and friends. I mean, this list goes on, right, of people who have innocently suffered for their righteous faith. They've essentially been persecuted, right? So what are the takeaways here? Well, let's be encouraged that God counts you worthy to suffer, should you have to suffer. Acts 5:41 says, the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been worthy of suffering disgrace for the name, and that's capitalized. The apostles rejoiced in their suffering. Be prepared for your suffering, okay? We're talking about Boy Scouts being prepared, right? Well, let's be prepared for if some point if we have to suffer. And how do we do that? Well, Ephesians 6:11 says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil and his schemes. Okay, this whole thing with Job, this is a scheme brought on by the devil. The devil brought it right to God, asked permission. God said, okay. And this is one of the Satan's schemes played out on Job. But obviously Job, he had the armor put on, right? He never renounced God. He praised God throughout the whole time he was suffering. Pray for blessings in the midst of suffering. 85%, this is an incredible stat here, okay? 85% of married couples divorce after their child has been diagnosed with a serious illness, regardless if the child survives or not. And I saw this firsthand when I was at UAB and I worked in like the children's hospital there and worked in the children's deformity clinic. And you would see these kids come in with this CP, cerebral palsy, okay? And they were mentally retarded, they non-ambulators, confined to a wheelchair, needing 24-hour care. And it was rare to see the husband and wife still together. Usually it was just the wife had, and occasionally it was just the dad had the child. But it was suffering, okay? And don't know what kind of suffering it was, but it was suffering brought on. And suffering can rip marriages apart. It can rip families apart. You know, I think about all the other kids in those families. You know, they probably want to divorce their families, but they can't because there's so much emotional distress and so much of the blame game going on, right? As opposed to just everybody getting on their knees and praising God and praying for blessings in the midst of suffering. So you got to remember, you got to pray for blessings and pray in the midst of your suffering. And we see Job did that. Another thing that I think prepared me for this lesson, if we were driving back from Atlanta yesterday, and I like to read the Wall Street Journal and Fox News, and there was an opinion article, and it talked about a family. I don't know if any of y'all read this yesterday. It talks about a family, a young boy who's 17 months old. He has Down syndrome, and he has a disease called Hirschsprung disease. That means a part of your bowel doesn't work, okay? And you don't really know it, but you see it in infants. And you don't know it until they just get sick. Because what's happened is the food is not going through that portion of the gastrotracheus. They get basically stopped up, and then they can get a rupture of the small intestine, and then they get septic. And many times they die. Well, this kid went listless. And he was with the dad's sister. So he was over at Aunt and Uncle's house. Well, they took him to the ER, and when his parents, Rebecca and Caleb, got there, Rebecca got to the bedside, and the girl who's basically reporting this said that she did one of the most amazing things. She got down on one knee, and she said, I don't want to mess this up, so I'm going to pull up the article. see here. So I'll put it on. Though it says the woman's response was unforgettable. She got down on one knee. She says, God, I'm going to worship you right now. No matter what happens, you're still holy. You're still good. And at that point, her son was lying there lifeless, sick, and septic shock. And the doctors were telling her this is not good. And in the days to come, is actually the article goes on that there was actually an uphill climb. At some point, the doctors came out and basically told in few words that the boy's not going to make it. Well, then it turns out he makes a turn for the worse. His bowel starts healing, and he's had several surgeries now, but he's still alive. And he's still got several struggles to go through, but the boy is still alive. But it's a great article. And you know what? I'll actually put the article on our group me so you guys can read it. So we got to pray in the midst of suffering, right? All right, so here's a good thing. 3 things not to say to a friend who's suffering. All right? First thing is, it could be worse, right? All right? This is pretty obvious, right? It could be worse. So God is not dismissive of our hardships, and neither should we, okay? The second thing is, you don't say, well, what is God teaching you through this? Or God will work together for the good, okay? Now, that may be correct, okay? And you may be, because since you're not suffering, you may can see the forest for the trees. But to someone who's suffering, they can't right then. And if anything, that response basically makes them feel like that their suffering is a riddle, and that God wants them to get something out of it. And then they're trying to figure out why they're suffering, and when really they just need to suffer, and they need to be with God, and they need you to be present, and they need your help. So don't, and you can maybe talk about that later, but somebody in the immediate case of suffering, don't say that. The response suggests that the person has done something to warrant the suffering. The third thing is, if you need anything, call me. If you need anything, call me anytime. Just call me. Okay? Here's the thing. People who are suffering, they don't know what they need. Okay? When you're in the middle of suffering, if you've seen somebody suffer, they don't know what they need. Okay? And they're certainly not going to call you. Okay? They're depressed. They kind of just want to be alone with their thoughts and suffer. So if you feel like that there's something you can do for that person, instead of saying, just call me if you need anything, you go do it, right? Okay? So if you know they got dogs at home, they need to be fed, you go to the store, buy some dog food, go over there, feed their dogs, okay? Look for things to do to help that person. Don't just make some flippant comment that you're going to be available for them. This is an article by Edward Welch, and it was on IBelieve.com. I thought this was interesting, so I brought this today. Here's the take home, okay, guys? Your physical presence to a hurting friend can provide comfort in and of itself, even if you have no words to say. Sometimes we see a friend who's suffering, and we want to be with them, and we want to say the right things, and we don't know what to say. But know that you don't have to say anything. And probably the most comforting thing you can do is be there and not say anything, okay? Any thoughts? We've been through a lot today. Appreciate you guys sticking with me. We're not too bad on time either.
I'll say something. So when I was diagnosed with melanoma, I had a friend, one of my great college friends that was in seminary at Bethel in California at Reading. She called me. Well, she flew in first, and then she really just to kind of be there and to pray. And she gave me the best advice that anybody ever gave me before the whole year, through surgeries and all that stuff. She said, and she actually said it as she was praying, she said, people are going to say stupid things. And I pray that the Lord, that the Lord you can help Meredith to guard her heart against people that mean well, but they say stupid things.
Wow,
and
that's profound.
If I had a dime for every stupid thing good friend said to me,
yeah,
exactly like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
be rich.
Just don't say anything. And really, John 9, was kind of like my theme verse for the year, and it's when the Pharisees were asking Jesus these questions, and they had this blind kid that came up, and he said, Jesus, tell us, what did the parents do that this child was born blind? And he said, nothing. He was simply born blind so that the Lord would receive glory. That's it. That's the whole, and I think in Job, we focus so much on wickedness and wicked, being the reason for everything, when in reality, way we should just simply be looking up, because that's the whole
That's
reason.
right. Because God has a plan,
Absolutely.
and it's incomprehensible to us. There's no way we're going to understand it.
Right.
And
I really appreciated the study,
Yeah.
because I've never thought about when friends come in and just sitting silent for 7 days and how
right.
that's exactly what we should do.
And they should have just kept their silence.
Yes.
Yeah, then left. Yeah,
They should
right.
have left, yeah. Through, but
Right.
no, we just, because we do, we mean so well, and I'm a fixer kind of person, I
Right.
would say the right thing too, but in
Right.
reality, don't say anything.
Just be there. And be a doer. You know, do things for that person.
My husband and I went through like a 10-year medical infertility / nightmare. And along the way, we lost about 8 ectopic pregnancies. And both of my fallopian tubes were taken out. We kept going back to the ER. It was just a nightmare. And ultimately, we wound up in the future. I know you guys probably know people walking that journey, but I can remember people avoiding us, for things. That's another part of it too, just not, let's just, here she comes,
Yeah.
And I can remember feeling like, I wish that, people would just celebrate life and not, celebrate it generally, but not, not that whole fraction that's starting to happen when people were having babies and that kind of thing. But the Lord, through that journey in my life, started talking to me about 1 Peter 4. Don't be surprised at this fiery ordeal that comes against you. Because I would sit, and for a while it took me a season to get over the shock of kind of where we were. But, he brings about these things so that we have a deeper revelation of
Right.
him. And a deeper revelation of his glory in our lives and just who he is. And I can remember about, maybe 10 years down the road, and flash forward, my first son is born. And I'm looking at him, almost feeling like he's going to get in the way of this thing me and Jesus got going on. Because we had gotten, my spiritual life had been pressed and squeezed, and that love was just so great. And sometimes I long for that back.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Right, absolutely.
Because it was just so raw.
Right.
So I do think that
Suffering brings about like a purity
it does.
between you and God, and that's what happens in metals. You put it in the fire, it becomes more pure.
For strong people. like
Right.
me.
That's
Some
right.
people would
Some people it goes the other way.
turn some other
That's
way.
exactly right.
Well, and it talks about, staying thankful during that.
Right.
And I think that's key. I have to tell myself that now and other things.
Right.
But to make sure to be mindful of what's happening right now is about you. And this is going to come to an end. And it's going to be all for your glory and my understanding and my revelation of who you are, Jesus. And in heaven, there's something that can't be taken away.
Right.
There's things that won't leave. There won't be suffering. It keeps us pressing on.
That's right. It's incredible thoughts. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else?
I have a friend who, a real extreme what not to do. Her husband had pancreatic cancer, and, the diagnosis was terrible. The prognosis was worse. And she had friends from her church come and say, if you just have enough faith, you will be healed. And that's so hurtful.
Mhm.
Because people die who have great faith. And she just prayed and she said, Lord, tell me what to say to these people who are being hurtful and not meaning to. And I thought she had the best response. She said, well, I guess Jesus didn't have enough faith because it's obvious Joseph died at some point before he died, and Joseph was his earthly father. So that's sad to me that Jesus obviously didn't have enough faith for his own father, earthly father. So,
Right.
I thought that was a great response.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it's not about how much faith you have.
Right.
People with great faith suffer.
That's right.
So those friends were like friends to Job.
Undoubtedly. And that's what's so cool about Job. It's not only does it teach us about suffering and how to suffer, but it also teaches us what to say to somebody and what not to say to somebody who's suffering. So there's just so much for us to glean in this. And we're not even through, okay? So we basically got through the 3 friends' discourses today. Next week, we're going to move on to the chapter about wisdom, where Job talks about wisdom. And we're going to get into Job's kind of closing arguments, which are really good. So, Bill, you up next week?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right,
Joe goes, I tell you.
for sure. Russell, you want to pray us out? Oh, no, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to mention, there's a great little book, Problem Pain by C.S. Lewis. A lot of you probably read it, but can help with this topic. Kind of a lot of bad things happen, particularly a lot of bad things happen to good people.
Right.
Kind of don't get quick, easy reading. If you assert from God's word that His nature is good, that God is love, then that question of why are so many bad things allowed to happen, particularly for people, becomes pretty important questions. I read that book.
Yeah.
You kind of sort of.
Yeah, there's some great quotes in that book. There's some great quotes in that book.
Yeah.
By C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Lord, we thank you for this Sunday morning. Thank you for this time. Thank you for programming for his preparation for the word brought. Lord, thank you for Joe, what we learned from it, and about you, about your character and